Order, order. We start with questions to Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, Gregory Stafford.
Good afternoon, Mr Speaker. Question number 1.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Government is supporting local planning authorities to facilitate the delivery of more high-quality, well-designed homes. But we know that capacity is a problem with councils, and that's why we've also announced £46 million package of investment to support capacity and capability in local planning authorities, including 300 new planners, support to local authorities with delivering their local plans and greenbelt reviews, and we'll also make changes to planning fees so that councils can recover the costs of planning applications.
Gregory Stafford.
I thank the Secretary of State for her response, but in Waverley and East Hampshire, housing targets by this government are doubling. And when my constituents move into those homes when they're built, the infrastructure and services are simply not there. And by services, I don't mean a phalanx of civil servants to help them move house, but instead the schools, the play areas, the supermarkets and the road network. So will the Secretary of State come to my constituency of Farnham and Bordon and see where we need that infrastructure so that she can understand the implications that her housing targets have on my community?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr Speaker, we know that as part of our planning reforms and the mandatory housing targets that we've put forward, that we need infrastructure. And this government will make sure that infrastructure is there, whereas I would say to the honourable gentleman that it was his government that allowed speculative housing developments that failed to meet their housing targets and left people without the houses they desperately needed.
Jayne Kirkham.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We have a number of schemes for social housing in Cornwall, relying on the Affordable Homes programme that ends in 2026. Could the Secretary of State please confirm that there won't be a gap in the provision of funding so that the provision of those homes can continue?
I thank my honourable friend for her contribution, and of course we set out another £500 million for the Affordable Homes programme, and we'll set out further requirements as we get to the spending review.
Secretary of State, Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The increase in housing delivery she is committed to requires a 50% uplift across the board in terms of housing numbers. According to the House of Commons Library, urban and major conurbations are seeing an increase of 17%, whilst mainly rural areas are seeing an increase on average of 115%. How is that fair?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr Speaker, the Shadow Housing Secretary will know, the Shadow Secretary of State will know that our mandatory housing targets were based on affordability and were to ensure that people are able to get the houses they desperately need. Under his government, they removed the mandatory housing targets. We saw speculative developments and we saw them fail year upon year to deliver the housing that this country desperately needs. We're going to deliver the houses where they failed.
Duncan-Jordan.
Question 2, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, with your permission, I'll take questions 2, 3, 6, 15 and 19 together. By the end of this Parliament, this Labour government will have finally brought the feudal leasehold system to an end. On the 21st of November, I made a detailed written ministerial statement setting out how the government intend to honour that manifesto commitment, including the steps we'll take to implement reforms to the system already in statute.
Duncan-Jordan.
Every week, my constituents in Poole, many of whom are retired, contact me with their concerns about the leasehold properties that they're living in. They're worried about excessive service charges, unfair ground rent, exit and event fees. Can the Minister reassure them and me that the government will tackle these problems once and for all and will do so as a matter of priority?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I sympathise with the plight of his constituents. With regard to service charges in particular, we know that opaque and unaffordable charges are putting leaseholders and tenants across the country under immense strain. The government are committed to improving service charge transparency and making it easier to challenge unreasonable increases. In the coming months, we intend to consult on how the provisions in the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act relating to service charges and legal costs should be enacted with a view to bringing these measures into force as quickly as possible thereafter.
Surrey.
Many of my constituents cannot afford to buy their freeholds under the current leasehold legislation. When does the Minister think the legislation to ensure leaseholders can enfranchise easier, cheaper and quicker will come into force?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I appreciate fully the desire of her constituents to take advantage of the provisions in the 2024 Act that will make it cheaper and easier for existing leaseholders in houses and flats to buy their freehold. Unfortunately, as she will be aware, Mr Speaker, we discovered on assuming office that the previous government had passed the Act with a number of specific but serious flaws that prevent certain provisions, including those relating to enfranchisement valuations, from operating as intended. We need to fix these flaws through primary legislation, and we intend to do so at the earliest possible opportunity.
And Dixon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Earlier this month, together with about 40 Labour MPs, I met with the Managing Director of Thirsk. I raised the case of 90-year-old Tom, who lives in a retirement complex in Bingley in my constituency. Like many of the residents whose stories we shared, he has been hit by extortionate service charges that have risen way above inflation. Does the Minister agree with me that stronger regulation of managing agents is needed to protect pensioners like Tom and others in leasehold flats from unaffordable housing costs?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. We're very much aware that some managing agents provide a very poor quality of service to people like Tom and leaseholders across the country. Managing agents do play a key role in the maintenance of multi-occupancy buildings and freehold estates, and their importance, Mr Speaker, will only grow as we transition towards a common hold future. As such, we've made clear we'll strengthen regulation of managing agents to drive up the standard of their service, and we're considering carefully the recommendations made in Lord Best's 2019 report on regulating the property agent sector.
Joshua Reynolds.
Speaker, residents in a housing development in Maidenhead bought their properties 10 years ago on 99-year leases. Now they're coming to sell their flats. They're being faced with a charge of £15,000 to £25,000 each to extend their leases so the new owners can get a mortgage. So what's the Minister going to do directly to help these residents?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. In terms of lease extensions, there are provisions in the 2024 Act that will provide some assistance to his constituents. As with other parts of their Act, they require in many cases a detailed programme of secondary legislation. In some specific circumstances, we can't switch those provisions on until we've made the fixes that I referred to in a previous question through primary legislation, but we're working at pace. I'm more than happy to have a conversation with him about what we are doing in this area.
Dr Al Pinkerton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Residents living in Heath, a retirement community in my constituency, have reported regular and repeated withholding of invoices, excessive insurance charges, £107,000 worth of maintenance without any supporting rationale, and all of this adds up to a 70% increase in service charge since 2020. Can I ask, what is the Minister doing to ensure that not-for-profit companies like Kirkham Estates, who are, to be very clear, not a social landlord, are held to account? And would he concede to meet with me and residents from Heath and other Kirkham leaseholders to understand the challenges and anxieties that they face? Thank you.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. In addition to the measures I've already set out, we intend to proceed, as I said, on implementing the service charge transparency provisions from the 2024 Act so that residents in all tenures can more easily challenge unreasonable increases. Not-for-profit freeholders, I think, complaints can be made to the Housing Ombudsman. I'm more than happy to hear more from him about the particular circumstances in this case and give him further advice.
Charlie Juhas.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his reassurance to leaseholders. But what message does he have for freeholders like the residents of the Wolds View development in Driffield, who are trapped at the mercy of an unaccountable management company? Will he legislate to protect not just future homeowners, but those currently stuck in these contracts?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. We are determined to end the injustice of leasehold entirely, and will consult next year on legislative and policy operations to reduce the prevalence of such arrangements. But in terms of existing estates, we remain committed to protecting residential freeholders on them from unfair charges. Similar to previous questions, we need to implement the 2024 Act's new consumer protection provisions and bring these measures into force as quickly as possible. That is our intention.
Tim Farnham.
Question number 4, sir.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Government recognised that excessive concentrations of second homes impact on the availability and affordability of homes for local residents to buy and rent, as well as local services. From April, councils will be able to charge a council tax premium of up to 100% on second homes. But as the honourable gentleman will know, we don't think this is enough. We're considering what additional powers we might give local authorities to enable them to better respond to the pressures they face.
Tim Farnham.
Mr. Speaker, I'm encouraged by the Minister's reply. Towns and communities in my constituency like Coniston, Hawkshead, Poole Bridge and a whole range of other beautiful places have so many second homes that up to 85% of the properties are not lived in for most of the year, meaning those communities are under very serious threats whether they can survive at all. The government has done a number of things, including, of course, talking about short-term lets being a separate category of planning use. Would, however, the Minister agree to look at making second homes also a separate category of planning use so that we can prevent these beautiful places becoming ghost towns?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. As he will know, the previous government consulted on making short-term lets a different use class. It didn't consult on second homes becoming a use class. As part of our wider consideration of what additional powers we might give local authorities, I'm more than happy to have a conversation with him. I understand the pressures in his particular part of the world are particularly acute when it comes to both second homes and short-term lets.
Robin Swan.
Question number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK Shared Prosperity Fund supports people, businesses and communities across Northern Ireland and is an important part of this government's local growth funding. Our department is committed to evaluating the impacts of this fund, including in Northern Ireland. The UK SPF evaluation strategy is a publicly available document setting out our approach to do so, and the department is committed to publishing ongoing evaluation findings as they become available.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the voluntary community sector in Northern Ireland have said that the reduction of the shared prosperity funding that will be available in the next financial year, coupled with the increase of employers' national insurance contributions, are presenting a perfect storm at a time when even more is being asked of them. Would the Minister agree to meet with me, members of the Northern Ireland Council for Voluntary Action and representatives of the voluntary community sector to discuss these issues?
Minister.
I'm grateful for that question. The reality is we inherited a situation where the previous government had no money available for this. Now, I've no doubt that this transition year creates significant challenges, Mr. Speaker, for local organisations. I've visited the honourable gentleman before in South Antrim and met some organisations. I'd be delighted to do so again.
Mr. Speaker, Cornwall's Shared Prosperity Fund is good news and well needed. The government is reworking the outcomes for the Shared Prosperity grants, and councils like Cornwall are awaiting the Memorandum of Understanding for the grant before they can make agreements with providers. The ongoing schemes need certainty as they have employees relying on these contracts on 3-month notice periods, and the old SPF scheme expires on the 31st of March. Could the Secretary of State confirm...
I think in the way that it's obviously connected to Northern Ireland when you look at it.
I'm grateful for that question, Mr. Speaker. I know that local authorities from Northern Ireland to Cornwall are very interested in knowing not just their allocations, which of course was made available to them in recent weeks, but I know that some local authorities have concerns about making those spending commitments. You know, the money is there, the money is committed, but my officials are working, and I've had conversations directly about Cornwall to make sure that local authorities have the confidence to do so that we don't see 90-day redundancy notices.
Colin Naismith. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very, very excited indeed that high street rental auctions are capturing the imagination of local communities and indeed colleagues in this place. I think a common view for all of us is that vacant shops are a blight and that this is a great tool to tackle them with. We're working with some early adopters, but I'm encouraging all local authorities to come forward and to be active in this space. That's why, as of the 15th of January, we've made a £1.5 million fund available to support the delivery of these powers across the country.
Colin Naismith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Crewe Town Centre in my constituency is in a desperate need of a new year, new me. But for too long, we simply haven't had the tools at a local level to tackle the irresponsible, absent landlords presiding over empty shop units. The old M&S unit in Crewe, for example, is owned by an absent landlord who has left this crucial anchor unit in our town centre to rack and ruin. Will the Minister meet with me to discuss how we can remove the obstacles to bringing this crucial unit back into use?
Minister.
I'm grateful for that question. I'm sad to hear that the experience of Crewe, but I know that that is one shared, I think, perhaps up and down the country. I know Crewe has a proud record in the retail space, and I believe it can be again, but it is exactly as the Honourable Gentleman says, about assembling the right tools and powers in order to make it so, and I'll be very happy to meet with him. I would gently say, Mr Speaker, that the Honourable Gentleman is slightly unkind because he knows that Crewe Town Centre was the site of my biggest personal and professional embarrassment some nearly 17 years ago, but provided I'm still allowed back in, I will very gladly do so.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Rickmansworth High Street in my constituency is a thriving hub for the community, supported by its fantastic local businesses. Having spoken to many of these dedicated business owners, I know the challenges they face. What steps is the Minister taking to support local authorities in delivering initiatives such as rental auctions for high streets like Rickmansworth?
Minister.
I'm grateful for that question. We're really aware that with new responsibilities for local authorities comes new costs, and we know that, of course, local authorities want to spend their money as effectively as possible. So we've made available £1.5 million, including to his local authority, to make sure that they've got the capacity to make these powers a reality.
Chris Webb.
Question number 8, Mr Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We will deliver on our promise to transform the lives of millions of renters through our landmark Renters' Rights Bill. The bill will make renting fairer, more secure and more affordable by banning no-fault evictions, ending bidding wars and extending Arab's law to protect private tenants. I'm sure that my right honourable friend will agree with me that it was absolutely disgraceful that the Tories decided to play politics last week and vote down this vital bill, denying renters the protections they deserve.
Chris Webb.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Recent data showed that 75% of private rented sector properties in Blackpool have damp or mould, leaving tenants to suffer unacceptable conditions. I welcome the legislation brought forward in the government's Renters' Rights Bill, which will introduce a decent standard for homes in the private rented sector. What steps is her department taking to ensure councils have the resources they need to enforce these standards?
Secretary of State.
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and I'm sorry to hear of that experience from many of his constituents. Most private landlords, Mr Speaker, provide a good service to their tenants, but for the few landlords who fail to take reasonably practical steps to keep their properties free from serious hazards, local councils will be able to issue fines of up to £7,000, and this will allow local councils to target their enforcement effectively on the small minority of irresponsible and criminal landlords.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Late last year, Bradnam Parish Council in my constituency contacted me, very concerned that the National Trust, who own a number of rental properties in the village, a very high number, are now leaving them empty and not putting new tenants in to avoid the burdens that this government is placing on landlords. So will the Secretary of State agree with me that there is a balance to be struck here, and what advice can she actually give areas like Bradnam, who are now facing being an empty village?
Well, this action, and we'll make sure that empty homes are brought back into use, and we make no apologies, Mr Speaker, for asking that homes are of a decent and safe standard. People should be able to live in their homes without the risk of hazards that are dangerous to their health.
Dame Hillier.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, in my constituency, one of the big challenges for the private rented sector is those that have to house families who are in temporary accommodation. So it's a 5-year tenancy very often, sometimes longer, but these are families who really shouldn't be in these sorts of homes, often overcrowded, leading to damp and mould, whatever the best intents of a local authority to house them. So in order to improve standards across the board, will the right honourable lady, my right honourable friend, pledge to make sure that we're really pushing for that much needed affordable social rented housing, so those tenants can move into that and other private tenants can move into these homes, which will then be improved?
Secretary of State.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. She's absolutely right. 160,000 children and families were in temporary accommodation at Christmas, Mr Speaker. We need to build the homes, the social and council homes that we desperately need, so people have a home for life and not this situation that we've seen where local authorities are spending huge sums of money on temporary accommodation that doesn't help life chances of those young people.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. During the last Parliament, I visited a family in Stampnell in Ashfield who lived in private rented property, and it was disgraceful. There was damp, there was electrical problems and flooding in the property. But this property was covered by the landlord licensing scheme. Not only that, the landlord was actually the council leader of Ashfield District Council. So could the Secretary of State please remind council leaders that if they rent out private properties, or their councillors do, they should be held to a higher standard?
I think the Honourable Gentleman highlights as an issue across the board actually around where we haven't got decent home standards, and that's what we want to introduce, not just within the social rented sector but the private rented sector as well. We've seen far too many situations where tenants are too frightened to come forward with mould and damp and health issues with the properties. We've got to make sure those standards are upheld. It doesn't matter who it is, where it is, people should have safe, secure homes.
Deirdre Costa.
Question number 10, Mr. Speaker.
Front bench.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Our plan for change sets out the whole of this government is committed to the biggest increase in social and affordable housing in a generation. The previous government failed to take the social and, in particular, council housing seriously, and I'm determined to put this wrong to right. We've already taken decisive steps, including an injection of £500 million into the Affordable Homes Programme, our consultation on the rent settlement and reforms to right to buy, and we'll set out more details at the spending review.
Deirdre Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 14 years of Conservative government, Ealing Council has thousands of families waiting for a council home. An affordable housing programme it doesn't have the money to deliver. A report from Southwark Council released on Sunday found 71% of councils will have to delay or cancel house building projects. Will the Secretary of State look at ways of finally making local councils' housing budgets sustainable so we can build the affordable homes that my constituents in Ealing Southall so desperately need?
Secretary of State.
I thank my honourable friend, and she raises a very important point. And since taking office, we have set out a series of measures to support councils to increase their capacity, confidence and motivation to invest in new homes, Mr. Speaker. We're providing £450 million to councils to house some of the most vulnerable in society through the Local Authority Housing Fund, as well as injecting an additional £500 million into the current Affordable Homes Programme to deliver 5,000 new homes, and we're helping councils borrow from the Public Works Loans Board at a reduced cost until the end of 2025-26.
Graham Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We need a steady supply of affordable homes and also homes in the private rented sector. And further to my honourable friend's earlier question, it's easy to sound morally righteous while you demand ever higher standards. But if you wreck the private housing market, ultimately it will be the tenants who pay. So how can the Secretary of State answer the question of my honourable friend now and tell us how she will ensure that the private rented sector remains investable so that tenants have somewhere to live?
Secretary of State.
I'd say to the honourable gentleman, there has to be a balance struck. People need homes that are safe. Is the honourable gentleman saying they don't want to provide a decent home, Mr. Speaker, a decent standard? Because I believe a majority of landlords provide that decent home standard, and there's those few that don't, and where they don't, they need to be held accountable.
Just Southwell.
Question 13, please, Mr. Speaker.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I will take questions 13 and 22 together. Local growth funding is crucial to our growth mission and crucial to tackling regional inequalities. The Government will set out a refreshed approach to local growth funding at the multi-year spending review in the spring. This will end the beauty parades, end short-term decision-making and put local communities in charge of their own destiny, just as we committed at the general election.
Ilford is a hub of regeneration, offering opportunities to independent businesses in new spaces like Mercato Metropolitano. Ilford has thousands of small and medium-sized businesses, which make our high streets more vibrant and offer choice to locals. What's the government doing to support these businesses so they can thrive on our local high streets?
I'm grateful for that question, and as has been a theme, I think, of earlier questions, revitalising our high streets is a priority for this government, and we've announced a number of measures, including permanently lowering business rate multipliers for retail, hospitality and leisure properties from 26-27, introducing high street rental auctions and providing additional funding to tackle retail crime, all of which will support businesses and support our high streets.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Ayrshire growth deal, worth over £250 million, has the potential to stimulate growth and create jobs across the region. Yet local delivery of ambition of the growth deal is slow and stagnant. What message would my right honourable friend send to spark action from the 3 Conservative SNP-run administrations in the region so that Ayrshire can realise its potential as a world-class business region?
Minister.
I am sorry to hear this, Mr Speaker. For our part, the UK Government is working very closely with both local partners and the Scottish Government to deliver what, as the Honourable Lady says, is a more than £250 million Ayrshire growth deal. And as part of this, we're supporting a programme review to make sure that if there are any strategic changes that need to be made to make sure those originally envisaged benefits are realised, and they do so. In terms of a message that my honourable friend asks for, what I would say is exactly as we have committed as a government in this area, we need to move at pace now so that the people of Ayrshire get what was promised.
Roger Freeman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The villages and towns of mid-Norfolk are reeling from the cost of living crisis and the government's tax attack on jobs and on small businesses. Rather than tax rural areas and spend the money in cities, could I suggest that ministers would allow rural councils to keep the proceeds of their own growth and incentivise them to support businesses out in our rural communities, rather than allow the government to milk rural areas to spend the money in cities?
I mean, I can't accept that characterisation from the honourable gentleman. I think that if you look across the decisions made by this government, whether it's the support that's going into rural communities, whether it's rural policing, whether it's the different business rates reductions that we're making, we do want to support businesses in those communities to thrive, and we'll continue to do so.
Jim Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for his answers. I know the Minister is a regular visitor to Northern Ireland, and he does that because he loves our Northern Ireland, and he wants to ensure that we also play our part in an economic boost. Can I ask the Minister, has he an opportunity in this new term of government to speak to his equivalent in Northern Ireland to ensure that we can go forward together as we should? Thank you.
I'm grateful for that point and the very kind points that the honourable gentleman makes. I do have a strong personal enthusiasm for Northern Ireland. I think that the potential in NI is huge. I absolutely do speak to ministers in the Northern Ireland Executive frequently, and will continue to do so. As part of the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister's reset of our relationship with the devolved administrations, we're meeting regularly, we're planning together to make sure investments we're making, make sure investments they're making are getting the best value. So I'll continue to do so, and I look forward to working with my honourable friend as well.
Shadow Minister Davidson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We share the Government's ambition around local growth, but with Companies House reporting the highest levels of business closures in 20 years, will the Government commit to publishing an assessment of the impact their national insurance rises, business rate rises and changes to business property relief are having on these local growth plans?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The work, I have no doubt that the opposition will have all the information they need available to scrutinise the government of the day, and we always do that in full transparency. What I won't, I'm afraid, accept is that somehow the sand that our economy was built on for the previous 4 years by the honourable gentleman, by the Secretary of State, somehow is this government's failure. The reality is that the honourable gentlemen know exactly as we do that we're fixing the mess that we left, and they can, of course, they will have the chance to oppose along the way, but the reality is we're going to get on with delivering for the British people. They're going to get on with carping from the sideline, and I know where I'd rather be.
I bet.
14, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I recognise that social housing providers need support to build their capacity and make a greater contribution to affordable housing supply, including via Section 106. To assist this, we've proposed a new 5-year social housing rent settlement and permitted councils to keep all of their right to buy receipts.
Clive Betts.
Thank my honourable friend for that answer. I know he's really committed to increasing the provision of social housing. Most social housing in the last few years have been provided through 106 agreements. But according to the National Housing Federation, there are now thousands of houses around the country where they can't be purchased under the 106 agreements, although the houses are available, because RSLs simply haven't got the resources to do it. I'm sure my honourable friend's aware of that problem. Has he got any particular plans to deal with it, to bring these houses back into badly needed use?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. The Government certainly recognises the ongoing challenge posed by the reduced appetite of registered providers of social housing to buy affordable homes delivered under Section 106 agreements. As my honourable friend is hopefully aware, Homes England's Section 106 Affordable Housing Clearing Service was launched back in December alongside the revised NPPF, with the aim of supporting buyers and sellers of Section 106 homes to find each other more effectively. We're calling on all developers with uncontracted Section 106 affordable homes, as well as registered providers and local planning authorities, to engage proactively with this new service. We'll consider what further measures may be necessary to address the problem, informed by data from it.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. There are private developers in my constituency in Bridgewater that have obligations to build social homes under Section 106 and are ready to do so. The difficulty they face is there is no social landlord available to take those units. Now, when I raised this issue with the Deputy Prime Minister in October, she said she was aware of the problem and was working to tackle it. So would the Minister please update the House on the progress made?
Minister.
I'm not sure if the honourable gentleman just heard my previous answer, but I've just made clear that we acted on the 12th of December to establish a matching service. And so I'd advise him to go and speak to that developer and ask him whether he's taken advantage of that service. We want to learn the lessons and see what data comes out of it to see whether we need to take further steps. But we think that matching service will allow both registered providers and developers trying to offload Section 106 units to come together to see if agreements can be reached.
In room.
Question 16, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 16th of December, I wrote to all councils in two-tier areas and neighbouring smaller unitaries, including in Devon, to set out plans for a joint programme of devolution and local government reorganisation. Later this month, I intend to formally write out to those councils on the shortlist to ask for interim proposals by March and fuller proposals later in the year. And we will confirm that as soon as possible. We know it's important to have that clarity.
In room.
Mr. Speaker, obviously any reorganisation will impact council finances. My constituency of North Devon has coastal towns with real pockets of remote deprivation, isolation and poverty. Now that his department has cut the Rural Services Delivery Grant, what methodology will be used to ensure that local government funding does not overlook these areas?
Minister.
Well, I say with respect that he's conflating two entirely separate issues. One is reorganisation that will take money away from the back office onto the front line where people can see the benefit of that investment. But just on rural services, to be absolutely clear that the provisional settlement that was laid out ensures that primarily rural councils get an average increase of 5% and no council sees a net reduction in their income levels. So that is our commitment to rural communities and it's firm.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I refer to my register of interest as a serving councillor on Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council. Many councils have undergone significant reorganisation already, from moving from shared services right the way through to full unitarisation, and the costs of that have always been underestimated. Although transformation leads to lower long-term revenue costs, we know councils everywhere are teetering on the edge. So finding funds to pay for the reorganisation, transformation and redundancies will be problematic. The mayoral authorities add an extra complication. So can the Minister confirm that funding from central government will be provided to fully cover both devolution and LGR, so councils don't have to factor extra costs in their 25-26, 26-27 budgets or risk reducing local services further?
Well, I should say that the government is not requiring any area to reorganise. What we did do was to write out and invite proposals to be submitted, and I pay tribute to councillors across the country for the leadership that they have shown in putting those proposals forward. In terms of investment to support LGR or devolution, of course that will follow a bit later, but to be clear that this is a bottom-up reorganisation being requested by local councils, and they have our full support in that process.
Jones.
17, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Funding for homelessness services in England is increasing next year by £233 million, taking the total to a record £1 billion. This will help prevent rises of families in temporary accommodation and rough sleeping. And today I've announced the tripling of emergency winter pressures funding from £10 million to £30 million. Housing and homelessness is a devolved responsibility, but we engage with devolved administrations on a regular basis to share best practice to inform our cross-government strategy on homelessness, which is being chaired by the Deputy Prime Minister.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answer, and I welcome that announcement today. And given that young people's experiences of homelessness differ considerably from that of other age groups across all countries in the UK, will the Minister commit to addressing their needs specifically in the homelessness strategy that's coming up?
Minister.
My honourable friend makes a really important point about the impact on children and young people. It's an absolute scandal that nearly 160,000 children are in temporary accommodation, and we are determined to make sure that the government strategy, the long-term strategy, addresses those underlying issues affecting youth homelessness. And we are working with mayors, councils and key stakeholders, including in the charitable sector, to get us back on track to ending homelessness.
Shadow Minister David Simmons.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. St Mungo's have reported a 27% rise in rough sleeping in London under this government compared to the same period under the last government. Will this government commit to removing the ring fences that they've introduced to the homelessness grant, heeding councils' calls to give them back the flexibility they need to get rough sleepers and homeless households into accommodation and avoid the cost shunts they impose onto council taxpayers?
Minister.
I thank the Shadow Minister for his question. The fact is that this government is investing record amounts of funding to tackle the root causes, and that requires action on prevention. And we are working with councils to make sure that we address those underlying causes. And the reality is we've inherited a mess, Mr Speaker. Record levels of homelessness and rough sleeping, and we are determined to get a grip on that. That means action on prevention as well as addressing the impact of homelessness and rough sleeping, and that's what we're determined to do.
Jayne Croft.
Question 18, please, Mr Speaker.
Sorry. David Simmons. Shadow Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. One of the strategies that councils use to address homelessness is to move homeless households elsewhere in the country. And this can be an appropriate response, but needs to be done in consultation with the receiving authority. So does my honourable friend share my concern that Labour-led Rushmore Council is using the standards procedure to attack its own members for bringing this legitimate matter of concern to public attention?
Minister.
I thank the Shadow Minister. He will be aware that the lack of shortage in housing is driving out of area placements. On his specific example, I'm very happy to come back to him, but the Deputy Prime Minister has written to Council setting out their responsibilities, and that out-of-area placements should be a last resort, and we will continue to work with councils to make sure that we support them as they deal with the challenge of the underlying problem, which is around housing shortage and the crisis that's been left behind, and we are determined to make sure we get a grip by providing that support that they need with funding, as well as the 1.5 million homes that this government is determined to build.
Jayne Croft.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Question number 18.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With your permission, I'll take questions 18 and 20 together. The English Devolution Bill will strengthen public services by delivering on local government reorganisation and establishing more directly elected mayors who will have the new power to convene public services. The bill will also deliver a new health improvement duty for strategic authorities and enable more mayors to take on responsibility for police and crime commissioner functions and health functions as well, better to coordinate local public services. But the White Paper goes even further than mayors and reasserts the role of local government as leaders of place and the delivery arm of the government's missions.
Jayne Croft.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The catastrophic impact of the level of debt left behind by the previous Conservative Council is being felt all over Thurrock. Cuts to our services cut to the absolute quick, and the delivery for residents is at an all-time low. While I welcome the impact that devolution will have in terms of growth and value for money, what reassurances can the Minister offer my constituents that devolution finally offers us the chance to turn the page and really deliver where it matters for my constituents?
Minister.
Well, that is a shared ambition. The government is determined to take power away from Westminster and put it into the hands of local communities. But we also know that to drive better outcomes and better public services, that has got to be rested on fair funding. And for too long, councils have been impoverished while more expectation has been placed upon them. And so the funding reforms that we're currently consulting on will be part of that rebuilding of the foundation. But this is very much a significant project to get power away from this place to local communities.
Jodie Gosling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. English devolution provides a generational opportunity to unlock the potential of towns like Nuneaton. I thank the Minister for their time and support in making sure that we get these options right. Will the Minister continue to meet with myself and with council representatives to discuss the best options for unlocking growth and opportunity in Nuneaton.
Minister.
Yes, and can I start off by saying thank you for the meetings that we've already had to talk about devolution here, and actually with many MPs. I think on the last tally we're on about 140 one-to-one meetings with MPs, such as the interest that's being shown on devolution for the right reasons. So more than happy to continue those conversations and to welcome that local leadership being shown.
Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I draw the House's attention to my register of interests. Several mid-Leicestershire villages, such as Glenfield, Burston and Braunston Town, are extremely anxious at the prospect of being forced into an enlarged city unitary as a result of the English devolution bill. Will the Minister agree to meet with me to discuss this matter and give my constituents the assurance that they will not be forced into a city unitary against their wishes?
Minister.
Well, I mean, it's important to say that any request for local government reorganisation comes from local areas to make that proposal to government. It's for government to provide the process by which those applications can be heard. And over the last at least 4 years, there have been countless years where local authority elections have been postponed to allow for that reorganisation to take place. But to be very clear, both in terms of the postponement of elections, but also the boundaries that are then drawn for the unitaries, that will be a bottom-up approach, and it's our job to make sure that the process supports it.
Malton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister about the interaction between the planning reforms and devolution, which are two huge bits of legislation. In Tunbridge Wells, we have a local plan, yet in the new, we've been asked when we do our new local plan that we're going to have a 66% increase in houses, except we won't have a new local plan because Tunbridge Wells Borough Council will cease to exist. It will become part of the West Kent Unitary Authority. So could the Minister comment on how these two huge reforms interact and what it will mean for housing numbers in Tunbridge Wells?
Minister.
Well, I mean, in a sense, a council is only an organisation at a point in time, but there will always be a local authority responsible for that area. What we want to do is to make sure that the authority is strategic, but also it takes that wider view. And so, of course, reorganisation is part of that, but also a strategic authority to take that wider responsibility for aligning public service reform to local growth is really important. But when he talks about housing numbers, and I think in some ways we can miss how important this is. Housing targets are one thing, but let's not forget, for every one of those numbers, there is a family, there are people who currently don't have a safe, affordable place to live, and that's exactly what this agenda is about tackling.
Mary Linden.
21, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In December 2024, we published a revised national planning policy framework following extensive consultation. We are also making progress on developing our planning and infrastructure bill, which will be introduced in the coming months.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A constituent of mine is endeavouring to prevent her neighbour building an extension that affects the rights of access set out in her restrictive covenant. She was initially quoted £80,000 to £100,000 to take the neighbour to court. Such costs in civil law make it inaccessible to ordinary people. So will the Minister consider looking at ways restrictive covenants can be brought into the planning process as a material consideration?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry to learn of the experience of my honourable friend's constituent. Legal restrictions on properties are not usually treated as material planning considerations. The planning process only addresses whether the development is acceptable in planning terms. Material considerations must relate to a planning purpose, such as the character or use of the land. If my honourable friend wishes to write with me with further details about the case, I'll endeavour to explore it further.
Caroline Downage.
Mr. Speaker, in Gosport we are facing a massive increase in our housing numbers, and planners are putting in applications to build across the very last green spaces, the strategic gap between Gosport and Farnham, which already has air quality issues, and in an area where we already have the local infrastructure that is overstretched. What we do have, though, is an abundance of disused military sites. So I wonder what priority the Minister is giving to encourage development on brownfield sites rather than eating up the last remaining greenfields in areas like Gosport, which is already overdeveloped.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Government has a brownfield-first approach to development. We strengthened that approach to brownfield in the recent revised National Planning Policy Framework. We also published last year a brownfield passport working paper to explore further ways in which we might prioritise and accelerate the release of brownfield land. When it comes to plan making, Mr. Speaker, we're asking local authorities to take a sequential approach. Brownfield first, densify those brownfield sites if possible, work cross-boundary where possible, and only then explore grey belt release and greenfield release in extremis. On the particular issue of public sector land, Mr. Speaker, we are in conversations with departments across the board about how we can best optimise the use of public sector land across all departments.
McNally.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one in Britain today should have to face the cold and indignity of sleeping in the doorway. So today, my honourable friend, the Minister for Homelessness and Democracy, has announced the tripling of Rough Sleeping Winter Pressures Fund. This will make sure as many people as possible have access to a safe roof over their head and a warm bed to sleep in.
Right, McNally.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Safety experts have raised concerns about 95 high-rise blocks and nearly 300 other buildings found to contain high-pressure laminate panels in Scotland. 8 years on from Grenfell, the Scottish Government has shockingly spent less than 10% of the £97 million received from the UK Government for cladding remediation in 2020. Does the Minister agree with me that the Scottish Government has dragged its feet on this matter for far too long and has to act now to make these buildings safe?
Mr. Speaker, I agree that remediation has been too slow. This Government is laser focused on speeding up remediation of dangerous buildings, and I encourage the Scottish Government, for which this is a devolved matter, to increase their efforts, like we are, to increase the pace of remediation in Scotland.
Secretary of State, Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State agree that everyone should be treated equally and be seen to treated equally before the law, including planning law?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know where he's going with this, but yes, I think people should be treated equally.
Right.
Great. Why then is it that the Secretary of State, the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister have all intervened in the planning application for the Chinese Super Embassy, overriding the wishes and concerns of local residents, the local planning authority, the Metropolitan Police and security services, and indeed, most likely, the incoming US President?
Secretary of State.
I mean, Mr. Speaker, these are live issues, but what I will say is that security of our country and nation always comes foremost, and that's always what this Government thinks of first.
Dr. Maria Timble.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Constituents of mine in High Green were told a social housing repair project to their home would take 12 weeks. The project has now been ongoing for 64 weeks, with contractors leaving the works in a disgraceful condition. I welcome the Government's boost to building more social housing and an extra £350,000 of homelessness funding announced for Sheffield this week. How does the Minister plan to empower local authorities to ensure contractors deliver social house building and repairs to a high standard and on time?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All social housing tenants deserve to live in decent homes, to be treated with fairness and respect, and to have their problems quickly resolved. Under the regulator of social housing safety and quality standard, housing associations and councils must provide an effective, efficient and timely repair service for their homes, including setting timetables for completion, and clearly communicate this to residents. We will also, as my honourable friend will know, be introducing AWAB's law and a new decent home standard to set minimum quality that social homes must meet.
Democrat spokesperson Victoria Slade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently, a site in Corfmullen in my constituency of Mid Dorset North Poole was sold. A site of 1 acre house surrounded by lots of beautiful garden, and I think you can see where this is going. The neighbours raised the alarm that the trees were going to be taken down. They flagged it with the council, didn't see a problem, and a week later, in the dead of night, developers brought chainsaws and destroyed every bit of nature on the site. Will the Minister commit to bringing forward legislation to auto-protect trees above a particular size or age in their planning reforms so developers do not get away with environmental vandalism?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, all protections are already in place, but if the honourable lady wishes to write to me with further details of that particular case, which I obviously don't have the full information to comment on, I'll endeavour to look into the matter more carefully and provide her with a full response.
Sarah Owen.
Mr. Speaker, there are more than 600 households across Luton living in temporary accommodation. Families scattered across hotels and bed and breakfasts, waiting for homes to become available. The previous government's inaction on housing has made this painful wait even longer. It takes nearly a decade for a 4-bedroom property to become available in Luton. Can the Secretary of State outline what steps she has taken to shortening the waiting times and increase social housing stock for people in Luton North?
I thank my honourable friend for her question. The Secretary of State is leading the charge in building 1.5 million homes to tackle the supply challenge that we face as a country because of the housing crisis we've inherited. We've also announced £500 million in the Affordable Homes Programme in the budget, and funding for homelessness services, as I've said, has gone up by £233 million, bringing the total to £1 billion. And Luton, I'm pleased to say, will receive over £6.3 million. And furthermore, we are investing £210,000 in the emergency accommodation pilot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the Grenfell tragedy, the residents of North Point in my constituency of Bromley and Biggin Hill have had to pay charges of nearly £700,000 for waking watch, fire wardens and alarms. Given the government's manifesto commitments to better protect leaseholders from costs, what steps can the Minister take to help my constituents with the reimbursement of those charges?
Minister.
I'm grateful for that question. Sadly, I hear these stories across the country as well. The reality is the best step that can be taken would be for the developer to enter into the cladding safety scheme, to get the building remediated and get those costs removed. In the meantime, we make money available through the Waking Watch Replacement Fund so that that particularly expensive way of keeping a building safe could be replaced as well. So there is ways of tackling that pain in the short term. But the reality is the only solution really is the remediations of buildings, and that's why we're pushing on so hard through our remediation acceleration plan.
Bill Brittle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Transparency International recently reported that since 2010, £38.6 million in donations into UK politics has come from unincorporated associations which are not required to report their source of income. With that in mind, will the Minister close political donation loopholes in order to protect our democracy from foreign influence by banning unincorporated associations and shell companies which have never turned a profit from donating to political parties?
Minister.
Effective regulation of political finance is crucial for maintaining trust in our electoral system and our democracy. And the UK already has a strong framework which makes clear only those with a legitimate interest in UK elections can make political donations, but the government has committed in its manifesto to strengthen the rules around donations to political parties to protect our democracy from foreign interference, and we will bring forward proposals in due course.
The best objective.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently spoke to Chris Dodson, a local thatcher in Sawtry, who has recently raised the issue with me of the shortage of thatching straw, particularly long straw thatch. With Historic England insisting that Grade 2 listed properties should be replaced with like-for-like material and the chance of listed building consent to change from straw to water reed unlikely to be granted, could the Secretary of State confirm what the government is doing to ensure that thatchers are not hindered by the current guidance and the shortage of thatching straw?
I confess that is a question to which I do not have the answer. What I would say to the honourable gentleman is the government do intend to amend building regulations later this year as part of the introduction of future standards. It sounds like this issue, I think it came up in the private members' bill debate on Friday, is one we need to consider. I'm more than happy to sit down with him and have a further discussion about it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I met a young dad at Derby City Mission. He had been sleeping rough until he used their safe space night shelter and then was able to move into one of their bedrooms and had just been informed that there was a home for him to move into. Another step towards having somewhere that his son can visit him next Christmas. Will the Minister consider whether their stepped model is one that can be used to help more rough sleepers be ready for permanent accommodation?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for sharing this excellent example of the vital work of Derby City Mission, and I'm pleased they received £272,000 of government funding through the Night Shelter Transformation Project to help people off the streets and into their own accommodation. The government's investment of £1 billion, nearly £1 billion, will allow partners to develop vital services from those in need, and we will draw on lessons from her.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The hugely increased housing target for East Hampshire gets further skewed by the extent of overlap with a national park. Would the Housing Minister meet with me to discuss our unusual situation and the case for having two separately set housing targets?
Minister.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for that question. There are issues in such cases, particularly around the data that's available, and we're in conversations with the ONS about the particular issue, but I'm more than happy to meet with him to discuss it further.
Jonathan Davis.
Mr Speaker, residents in Oakwood, which is part of the City of Derby, are concerned about the impact of potential development on the last field adjoining Chaddeston Wood would have on the rich biodiversity of this designated local nature reserve. Can ministers tell me what steps they are taking to ensure we meet our much-needed housing targets while protecting nature and historic woodlands?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, ancient woodland and ancient and veteran trees are already strictly protected in national planning policy, while tree preservation orders safeguard individual trees or groups of trees of particular value. It is for local planning authorities to apply these protections effectively, as they have principal responsibility. I'm more than happy to discuss further with my honourable friend.
O'Brien.
Mr Speaker, my constituents, particularly in Great Glen, have just experienced devastating flooding. Under the last government, we opened up the flood recovery framework so they could get grants to protect themselves. When will they be able to access that money under this government?
Minister.
Well, the honourable gentleman will know in the case that's set out there that these decisions are taken on a case-by-case basis, generally depending on the extent of the damaging of the floods. Of course, we will look at that very closely. I'd be willing to talk to him as well to make sure that the accountability is there. Thank you.
Paula Barker.
Mr Speaker, tomorrow it will be 1,000 days from repeal of the Vagrancy Act 1824 being given royal assent. Yet this outdated, vindictive and utterly ineffective act is still driving people away from the support they need and into an already overloaded court system. There is no need for a replacement. Existing ASB laws are sufficient. So can I urge the Minister to please drop this peculiar and cautious civil service groupthink? We're 201 years on. Can she advise when the commencement date for the repeal will happen?
The Vagrancy Act is antiquated and no longer fit for purpose, and no one should be criminalised for sleeping rough on the streets. And we want to ensure we avoid criminalising those who are the most vulnerable, while also making sure the police and local authorities have the tools they need to make sure communities feel safe. And we're currently considering our next steps.
Lee Dillon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Would the government look at affordable housing being redefined in national policy so that it's pegged to average local income rather than at the whim of an overheated housing market?
Well, Mr Speaker, we did make changes to some of the definitions around affordable housing in the recently revised National Planning Policy Framework, separating out the definition of social rent. But I hear the concerns he made. I'll certainly bear them in mind as we develop policy going forward.
Rachel Hopkins.
For fire safety remediation works for buildings over 11 metres, there's a cap on non-cladding costs and leaseholders given 10 years to pay remediation costs. However, my constituent in a building under 11 metres has been informed he may have to pay costs within 12 months because the freeholder is a housing association and the restrictions around credit and debt. Would the Minister work with me to resolve this issue and allow some flexibility?
I'd be very happy to take that meeting. Our approach to under 11 metre buildings is to take them on a case-by-case basis and to seek to find a solution, and I'm very happy to do so with my honourable friend.
Village Shop and Cafe has become a lifeline in my Bath community for local people, but is now at risk of losing its premises. The £150 million Community Ownership Fund was crucial to help sustain these local assets. Can the Minister comment on the future of the Community Ownership Fund?
Minister.
I'm grateful for that question. The Community Ownership Fund came to an end with its previous round in December. The previous government, of course, left no future funding for it. But the Honourable Lady knows that we've made a significant commitment around the community right to buy. We've made a significant commitment around local growth funding. And with regards to future ownership funds, that will be a matter for the multi-year spending review later in the spring.
Rachel Maskell.
Mr Speaker, it was freezing over the weekend in York, and despite working with North Yorkshire Emergency Accommodation Services, I was unable to find accommodation for a very vulnerable constituent of mine. Will she ensure in the homelessness review that we hold local authorities to account and no resident is put in the box which is too difficult to manage their case?
Minister.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this case. This is a deeply troubling set of circumstances, and we will ensure not only in terms of the immediate response through the funding that we're providing, but also make sure that we bring in the perspectives and experiences of those who are affected in our cross-government strategy.
The planning
Inspectorate has overturned the democratic decision of Walsall Council and decided to allow a battery energy storage system to go ahead at Chapel Lane in my constituency, a greenbelt site in a historic open space. So I'd like to ask the Secretary of State, as this creates a dangerous precedent, if she can clarify, is this what we will now see more of under her new policies around the grey belt?
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Lady will appreciate that we cannot comment on live or concluded decisions, as to do so would prejudice them. Our policy on grey belt and how grey belt is released is set out in full in our response to the MPPF consultation.
And Lee Smisley.
Mr Speaker, recently I visited the Royal Mail Delivery Office in Heighton. Posties spoke to me about serious problems with low-level letterboxes, including causing bad back joint issues and an increase of bad dog attacks. One postie even showed me scars from a dog attack across his hand. So will the Minister meet with me, the CWU and posties to discuss this with regards to new builds?
Not least with a view to making myself the most popular member in the House, I will happily do so.
John Glenn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On Friday I met with the leader of Wiltshire Council, and he asserts that the way that the government have calculated the distribution of the compensation between in-house and commissioned services has meant that Wiltshire has not fared well in the local government settlement announced on the 18th of December. Will the Minister meet with me so I can understand better the thinking and relay that back to the leader of my council?
Minister.
Yeah, we know that local government are feeling the pressures. 14 years have not bode well for local government public services, but we do understand the pressure for national insurance, which is why the Treasury have committed £515 million to support councils in that endeavour. But I'm more than happy to meet about his particular circumstance.
Ryan Leishman.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Is the government considering compensation schemes for homeowners who have suffered financial losses due to RAC in their properties? And if so, I'm especially interested in bar the impact for the Scottish Government of any such scheme, as I have constituents from Telekutri who have had their lives seriously impacted.
Minister.
Well, RAC, as the honourable gentleman said, is a devolved matter. The responsibility for making sure buildings are safe is, of course, for that of the owners, but we keep RAC under active consideration in case there's any support that's needed.
Martin Wrigley.
May I draw attention to my register of interests? At Teignbridge District Council, I oversaw the commencement of council house building for the first time in 30 years. Will the Secretary of State meet with me and others to discuss what can be done to make it easier for other councils to build more council homes?
I commend the honourable gentleman for the work they do. We do want to see councils being able to contribute, Mr Speaker, to council housing, and I'll happily get the Housing Minister to meet with the honourable gentleman.
Sam Rushworth.
And I welcome the government's tripling of the emergency housing budget, but one of my constituents is about to be made homeless because debt incurred as a teenager means that she's not eligible for social housing. I wonder what the government would be willing to do to look at this, because I'm sure that the government doesn't think that debt should be a reason for homelessness.
I'm very happy to meet my honourable friend to discuss the case, but he will be aware that we are acting as quickly as possible to support local authorities so that they are able to provide the necessary support to those who are affected, as he's raised.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Many residents in West Suffolk who live in new build homes put up with management companies that fail to do the basics and what's expected of them, from sorting out roads, planting trees and maintaining shared spaces, often passing the buck to the developers who pass it back again. What plans does the government have to get to grips with these cowboy companies?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. As I made clear in answering a previous question, we remain committed to protecting residential freeholders on these estates from unfair charges. As I said, this year we'll consult on implementing the Act's consumer protection provisions, which will cover up to 1.75 million homes subject to these charges, and we intend to bring the measures into force as quickly as possible. I'm more than happy to discuss it with him further outside.
There are 160,000 children in temporary accommodation, and in many cases the definition of temporary is being stretched to breaking point. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the government's homelessness strategy needs to look specifically at the outcomes for children who've experienced long-term or repeated spells in temporary accommodation?
Secretary of State.
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, Mr Speaker. That's why we've got an inter-ministerial group. We're determined to tackle homelessness, because this is not just about children in temporary accommodation. It affects every single aspect of their lives and their outcomes, and our opportunities missions is determined to give every child the best possible outcome.
Good day, Amos.
Speaker, the New Homes Solar Generation, or Sunshine Bill, received a sunny disposition from all sides of the House on Friday in the Private Members' Bill debate. In the upcoming uprating of building regulations, will the Minister confirm that solar generation will be part of the requirements of all new houses?
Minister.
Well, the Government's position was set out in some detail on Friday when I responded to the Private Members' Bill, and as the honourable gentleman will know, I'm in conversation with the mover of that bill to shape the design of the future standards we're bringing forward.
Phyllis McAllister.
Mr Speaker, in Scotland we now have record levels of children living in temporary accommodation without a home to call their own. 10,000 children left homeless on the SNP government's watch. The SNP is taking Scotland in the wrong direction. Does the Minister agree with me that Scotland needs a new direction and a Scottish Labour government in 2026?
Secretary of State.
Yes, Mr Speaker.
Final question, Patrick Spencer.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Suffolk has a huge flooding problem, and part of the problem is being driven by overdevelopment in low-lying rural areas. So in her steps to reform the planning system, as well as build more houses, which I totally accept we need to do, can the Secretary of State promise to force councils and developers to properly account for flood risk, ensure developers that are held accountable to residents when developments are badly impacted by floods, and ensure housing targets favour homes built in dense urban areas?
Minister.
Well, as I made clear, Mr Speaker, we are prioritising development on previously developed brownfield land wherever possible. We encourage local authorities to look to that option in the first instance. We made changes to the NPPF to clarify the flood risk and issues that relate to it. I'm more than happy to, if the honourable gentleman wants to write me, to look into the specifics in his area in more detail.
Questions, let the front bench change over.